Thank you everyone for joining today and for being with us on this lunchtime talk. It's great to see everyone who's joining today. And just, yeah, thanks for being a part of today's event. My name is Leah, and I'm the events coordinator at Bay Nature Magazine. Many of you know Bay Nature as a quarterly print publication based in Berkeley, and we focus on nature and conservation topics local to the Bay Area. But we're also working on expanding our events program with virtual events like this, as well as in-person hikes and bio blitzes and similar. So this is going to be a really fun event, and it's one of many in a series of virtual talks and in-person outings. So I would like to introduce our guest for today, Garth Harwood. Garth has been an outdoor educator and naturalist for the entirety of his professional career, including over 25 years at Hidden Villa in Los Altos Hills, where he serves as senior naturalist. On the side, he has been teaching people of all ages the joys and frustrations of wildlife tracking since 2006. He's recognized as a certified level 3 tracker by Cyber Tracker International and co-coordinates the Bay Area Tracking Club. Thank you so much, Garth, for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you. Please, those of you listening, I invite you to turn your cameras on if you're able. We would love to see your faces and to see you for the event today. And if you have any questions while you are tuning in, please drop them in the chat, and we will get to as many as possible at the end of the presentation. So thank you all for joining, and I will turn it over to Garth.
Okay, thank you, Leah. For some reason, my screen sharing is paused. Let's see if I can figure out why that is. Okay, now I'm screen sharing.
I think
And-
we're seeing is right now we're seeing a white screen.
okay, the slideshow should be coming
There
up.
we go. That's perfect.
Good. Okay, great. Well, thank you for coming, everybody. Really excited to talk to you about one of my great passions in life, which has been wildlife tracking since about the turn of the century. Picked it up about that time and just never looked back. As you can see from my beginning slide, I think that tracking is for everyone. We have at our favorite tracking destination with the Bay Area Tracking Club had trackers out on the beach with us from the age of 2 to about the age of 92. So it's not about bushwhacking through tangles to go find out where the bear sleeps at night. It's really about just getting to know your world better wherever you may be and whatever you have access to. So I hope that you get a little bit more inspired to make it a regular habit from today's talk. So on screen right now, we have a couple of tracks that may be somewhat familiar to you, but maybe you didn't have the tools before to separate them from one another. On the left, we have a coyotes track with a penny in it. Penny is my standard scale indicator when I don't have a ruler with me. And on the right, we have a bobcat track. And so right now, there's probably a lot of things that would, if you really thought about them, stand out as differences between them. But we'll break that down a little bit later today in some of our other images. In the center, I have the front foot of a long-tailed weasel, which is widespread in the Bay Area, but seldom seen. So I find that learning from animals directly is also always one of my favorite methods to do things. And unfortunately, in the case of shy and nocturnal animals and ones like the weasel that spend a lot of their lives underground, sometimes that takes the form of studying roadkills. So I take pictures of animals' feet when I get a chance. So since we have that one up on screen right now, just note how little flesh is exposed to make contact with the soil or other substrates, how much fur there is, and think about what that would look like when that foot is pressed into something yielding to leave a track behind. You probably only in the most yielding of substrates actually notice the fur, but otherwise it might be blank spots in between parts of the foot, making it look very like an assortment of little pads. All right, moving on. I want to start today's presentation with a story from my personal experience. So this was not a typical day at the beach. And as the caption below states, this was the trail of a cougar. And the cougar was walking in a fairly relaxed manner off to the left. And there was something fishy about these tracks. My friend Kurt called me after he initially found them the day before I took this picture. And he had walked around and seen what he thought were probably lion tracks, mountain lion tracks on the beach which was a bit of unusual to see them out there on the open sand. And he had learned from me what to look for, and he found everything except for one weird situation, which was that you see the claw marks out in front of the toes. That's not supposed to happen. So he asked me to verify, and I said those really look like lion tracks, but I have never seen a lion's trail with claws all over it like that. So something's weird here. So the next day I went out by myself to see if I could uh, learn more and verify what was going on. So this is what I found when I got out there. I got out there and there were tracks everywhere on that beach, and Kurt's tracks were gone. So one of the wonderful things about tracking at the beach, and one reason we'll be tracking there with Bay Nature on the 1st of March, is that the tides and the winds both serve as erasers that kind of wipe the board clean and start with a fresh set each day. So Kurt's tracks were gone, which meant that all the lion tracks from the previous day that he'd been looking at were gone too. So I was looking at all new ones, and they were everywhere. So something was really strange here. And of course, very exciting too. So I dropped down and started making plaster casts of the best of the lot so I could have some records of these remarkable tracks. So in the foreground there, you can see that next to the measuring tape, the lion had sat in the sand on top of a dune with a good view of the surrounding beach because it was guarding something. So if you were to look a little bit more closely at that area, you might see, oh, so sorry, didn't mean to do that. In the foreground, there are two tracks that are a little bit deeper than the others, and they have horizontal lines behind them. What that is the two back feet of the lion, and they're actually, I measured one lion's hind foot once that was 14 inches long. So just like a house cat, the back feet are immensely long, but they don't usually put the whole foot down. So normally you just see the little toe area and this little portion of the foot. But when they put the whole back foot down, it's remarkable how long it is. So that's what you're looking at in that picture. And then behind that, you probably can see a divot. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see the cursor moving right there. Yeah, so you're looking now at that's where its little bum, furry bum was sitting, making a bigger divot in the sand. And behind the bum, there's the tail, long curling tail. So a cougar has a tail that can be, 3 to 4 feet long and as thick as a fire hose. It's a really remarkable tool. So it had been sitting there guarding things and moving to and fro on this dune quite a lot. It wasn't until later that I noticed way back here, there's this little subtle pile of sticks. I had been making plaster casts earlier, and I was now waiting for them to dry. So I was kind of just killing time. So I pushed around through the more vegetated portion of the dunes, and I came across that pile of sticks and took a closer look. So sorry, there we are. This is what I saw. I was looking through binoculars, and I got to see that inside that pile of sticks, which looked kind of constructed, almost like a pack rat's home, and underneath it was a pile of very fresh, very raw meat. And this was a very public beach and a popular picnic spot, and it was a big pile of fresh meat, and I could see ribs poking through, but I didn't know whose it was. So I knew right away I was dealing with a mountain lion's meat cache, but I didn't know who the victim was. So, and I also knew, and I looked up more on it later and found out that lions usually stay really close to a cache like this so they can just keep feeding on it as soon as they get hungry again. And they guard it rather ferociously. So if something comes around and snooping around their cache, they've been known to kill it and add it to the cache. So at this point, it was getting pretty jumpy. And of course, I'd been sitting down there making casts with my body crouched low and not looking up and around for about an hour at that point. So it was a pretty exciting moment. But I did take time for a couple of quick photos before I moved on. So that whole scene would have been entirely invisible to me if I had not, some years before that, decided that I wanted to learn about animal tracking. And because I did, and because I put in a lot of what a lot of our trackers called Dirt Time, just really exploring outdoors and trying to make sense of everything that I saw that it might be animal evidence. It led me to a point where I could begin to see things like where I'd not seen them before. So, like this crazy picture I've got in front of you right now, this might be the most exciting track I personally have ever discovered in my whole life. But I would have walked right past it before I took up the study of tracking. So by the time I came across this track, and you can see all the mountain bike trails and some hiker footprints and things like that here. So that's a pretty ordinary scene for us, right? But I had been tracking a cougar across all of this kind of terrain for some time at this point. And up here at the top of the screen, you can see a couple of fresh lion prints and there's a couple more off here on the left side of the screen. But what we have here in the center is where the whole lion lay down and rested and maybe even took a nap. So I'm just going to quickly walk you through it. So we're going to start over here. Here's the two ears. Here's the face and the snout. Here's the chest. Here's the front two legs. Looks like it wiggled a little bit. Belly, hind foot with that hind leg with that classic three bend look. Looks like they have two knees, but really one of them is their ankle. Here's the other back leg. And here, of course, is that long, magnificent tail. And the tail was twitchy too, so there's another tail impression here. And and then, as another tracker friend pointed out to me, that was my interpretation. And then later, another tracker pointed out to me that way up here is a whole bunch of fur prints. The lion had not only flopped down and taken a break, but it had also rolled up onto its back. And so you can actually see some striations in the dust here that were where its fur left impressions without any footprints associated. And then when it got up, it left these fresh tracks. So again, that's just an example that I wanted to share of things that are out there. They are there to, even on busy trails that you may spend time on, and they're there to be seen by people who have trained their eyes to see them. So I hope you become one of those folks. I see some hearts floating up on one of the bubbles, so thank you for that, because I'm pretty excited about it. So now that I hopefully have given you something to get a little bit excited about, I got to take you back to school and do something a little less thrilling, perhaps, but it's important. This is the stuff that's going to help make it possible to interpret what you see when you see animal footprints. So what I have here is just a couple of relatively ordinary canid tracks. I'm not quite sure which dog made these, but right in front of you, you see that they're labeled front and hind. Can you see a size difference between them? So four-legged animals typically do not have feet of the same size, front and back. What the sizes are going to be determined by is where do they carry their weight. So an animal that carries all its weight in its front shoulders and head area, really muscular up front, that is an animal that's going to have big front feet, and canids are like that. So both the dogs and the cats tend to carry most of their weight towards the front, and so they have a bigger front foot than back. So when you see a pair like this, one bigger and one smaller, you know right away which is the front and the back, if you have a general sense of what group they belong to. But another group, such as the raccoons, might have the opposite because they have a rather bulbous hindquarter, and that's going to be reflected in larger back feet. So that is yet another way to kind of figure out what kind of is getting started on tracking out what kind of animal you're looking at. Also, if you count the toes, you can see that there are 4 of them on each of these tracks. And I've numbered them because when you get down and dirty to analyze a track, it is useful to be able to refer to the toes individually. That gives you ideas about which right and left, for example. Or you may find a track of an individual that's got an anomaly of some kind, an injured foot or something like that. And if you know it's toe 3 on the left foot or left hind foot, then you can get to know that animal individually through the trails it leaves behind. So there's a variety of reasons it's good to be able to analyze it in this way. But we don't have a toe 1 listed. And that's because in mammalian evolution, like our paws, like all mammals' common ancestor, have 5 toes front and 5 toes back. But a lot of mammals have developed specializations such that their toes are now of a different number. Just think of horses with their single toe that touches the ground, or deer with their two toes that typically touch the ground. And there are also mammals that have 3 and 4 toes that might be touching the ground at any given time. So the dogs and the cats all share a 4-toed look, but it is kind of useful to know that the fifth vestigial toe is still present as a dew claw way back up on the wrist of dogs and cats. And occasionally they will land in such a dramatic fashion that it registers, but very rarely. So we're really just looking at toes 2 through 5. And they're numbered from the inside to the outside. So toe 2 would be your index finger, and then 3, 4, and 5 to your pinky. Another concept worth reviewing right here is that you want to be conscious of the negative space between the toes and the heel pad. That varies tremendously from animal to animal. So cats famously have very little of it, such that their heel pad is crowded up against the toes, leaving just a little line of negative space that is typically shaped like a C, C for cat. Whereas a canid, typically, there are variations. There's a lot of breeds of dogs out there, but they can have a big area of negative space that makes it possible to put a straight edge across the track at a diagonal and actually create an X without bisecting any toes or heel pad. So if you can make an X on it, it's most likely a canid. If you can't without bisecting a toe or a heel pad portion, then it is probably a cat. But the presence or absence of claws are also important. So in this case, we have very clear claw registrations. If the claws are there, you always include them in any measurements. That's part of the identification process. And you might also notice that there's the heel pad shapes are different on the front and on the hind foot too. That is also typical. So those are details to pay attention to. I've got a penny in here. Again, penny is exactly 3/4 of an inch in scale. It's might go bye-bye soon, but for a few years yet, we're going to have pennies around. And it makes a very handy scale indicator since it's of known size. And I try to keep one in all my jacket pockets so that I've got one handy at all times. But I also carry a 6-inch rule in one of my pockets, and even a measuring tape for longer phenomena, because that's my gig. That's what I do all day. So look for good stuff to learn and to teach about. All right, moving on. Now I'm going to give you some information that maybe you can use, because if you let it be known that you've taken an interest in tracking, people are going to start sending you pictures of dog prints and telling you they found a mountain lion. And you're going to have to find a way to convince them otherwise, like you know what you're doing. So here's some ways to tell. So we've got a cougar on the right there and a wolf, the only wolf I've ever tracked in the wild, on the left. And on the front edge of the wolf tracks, especially that giant front, you can see really strong claw registrations. Wolves always show their claws. Domestic dogs pretty much always do too, unless they've recently had a nail trim. But also notice that the whole footprint taken as a whole is much longer than it is wide. That almost always, not 100% of the time, but almost always true for canid tracks. And that there's a big area of kind of blank space in that front foot for all that negative space that in this case wasn't in a soft enough material to bulge upwards, but it can actually make an X-shaped mound in sand and other soft materials. But it's a big blank in there. Whereas the cougar track has that very minimal amount of negative space. The heel pad is just a really big chunk of the surface area of the track as a whole, much bigger proportion of the track as a whole, and it's wider, or at least as wide as it is long. And of course, no claw registrations, even though it was pressed deeply into the mud. So those are just a few ways that you can be reasonably sure what you're looking at, assuming that each of these things is at a scale that suggests you're dealing with one of the larger mammals of our region. And I do include wolves as being in our region, even though they're not confirmed in the Bay Area yet. They are spreading and being seen in more and more portions of the state. And I look forward eagerly to the day when they find their way to us as well. Let's talk about birds for a moment. Birds are funny. A lot of people might be forgiven for thinking that birds aren't going to be very interesting to track or even very trackable, because what is there to know? They all have those little chicken feet looks. Um, well, no, they don't. So at the tracking beach that we often call our home base for the Bay Area Tracking Club, um, we do a lot of bird tracking because a lot of birds, as it turns out, visit the beach, not just the expected shorebirds, but waterfowl and seabirds come in that wouldn't ordinarily spend time on the shore. Maybe they're not feeling well or something like that. And then even weird stuff like owls come to the beach with surprising regularity. So we find their footprints. So the classic bird track, I'm sure it's very familiar to you, with toes pointing forward and a single toe pointing backward. So on the left hand there, I have the footprints of a turkey vulture that was coming in to explore a dead animal. And in turkey vulture, in birds in general, when they are showing a back toe, that's their toe one. And then the toe numbers go from the inside to the outside again. So toes 2, 3, and 4, but they don't have a toe 5. Their ancestors didn't have one either. So they're different from us in that respect, but they are similar to us in that they're bipeds. So their styles of movement are very intuitive to us. So they walk, they run, they hop, and they can even skip. But as we'll see, that the mammal gaits are really different than that, and kind of hard to wrap our minds around. It's a little bit like learning a foreign language that's complex, because you really have to get your mind into a different space to think in four-legged and to understand how they're moving. But we'll talk more about that later. So right here we have the turkey vulture, which is a classic anisodactyl, or the 3-and-1 toe layout. But sometimes you'll find one that's got a 2-and-2 foot toe layout. So 2 pointed forward, 2 pointed backward. And that is a pretty unusual kind of foot. It really only belongs to the owls or the woodpeckers or the roadrunners in our part of the world. So when you find one of those, my attention always gets riveted, because I know I'm dealing with an uncommon bird to see the tracks of. And in this case, we're looking at the track of a burrowing owl that spent time at the beach. There have been a couple of winters where large numbers of them have showed up on beaches, and we think they are running around because they make these crazy erratic trails, like they're catching large sand fleas at night. So who would have ever expected that? But tracking reveals that kind of thing, because I like to say the tracks never lie. So when you see that story told in the sand, you know things that is such insider information you won't even find it in scientific papers in many cases. And then again on the right, we have the other kind of specialized foot where webbing is apparent, holding all the toes together. And in this case, it forms sort of a hemispheric arc, all 4 toes wrapped up with webbing, and that's the track of a pelican, a brown pelican. But cormorants also have a foot like that. Again, a very specialized type of foot for an aquatic lifestyle. Not seen that often, always exciting when you find it. So let's think about what you want to look at when you find a track and you're really intrigued in it. Let's just say we've just come across this track on the right side there. These are some things you could quickly check in with yourself about when you are analyzing that track. Again, scale indicator, took a picture. That gives me the opportunity to study an ephemeral track over time later and come back to it at my leisure, compare it to what's in my field guide in the evening. Even though it might be one of 100 things I looked at during the day, I can now study it at my leisure. But one of the things you want to ask yourself is it a single track or a double? When we have new trackers out on the beach, oftentimes people will get completely flummoxed because they never heard of anything like that. It's got 8 toes. Well, that's because a 4-legged creature has got to put its hind foot somewhere in relation to its front foot. And the answer to that solution is often to put it right on where the front foot just was. So as when the front foot lifts out of the footprint, the hind foot slides right in there, completely covers it up. And it is not uncommon to see an entire trail made of nothing but hind feet, because every single one of the front feet has been expertly landed on by those hind feet coming forward. Speaking of front and hind feet, you definitely want to become skillful at determining whether you're looking at a front or a hind foot, a right or a left. Those will help you analyze an animal's activity. So in the opossum tracks there on the right, you can see the big toes or the big thumb sticking out to the right in each case, which means that it is left feet because that's those big toes are on the inside of the track always. I mentioned before the importance of taking measurements, particularly if you want to become skillful at tracking. You shouldn't skip this stage. I rarely see the tools come out and people actually record that when we're on the beach, but I always admire it when I see it because I know that person is going to grow faster as a tracker than other folks. Um, so I love to see people bring a journal in which to put these things too, by the way. I also tend to carry one of those with me at all times. Um, so take it, for example, the cats of our area. Do people ever dump house cats out in the countryside? Oh yeah. So you can never assume that you're looking at a bobcat in a wild space when a house cat is still a possibility. The difference between them can usually be determined by measurements. And cougars, same thing. A small cougar versus a large bobcat, that could be very confusing, but there is a way to differentiate that by precise measurements. Really important. The toe count on the fronts and the backs. Maybe you can see in these tracks that each the front and the back feet have 5 toes, and our dogs and cats had 4, right? So, and then there are some animals, like the rodents, are famously like this, where they've got 4 toes up front, but they show 5 in the back. So, if they're that same front and back or different, those are things to take good notice of and make sure you note down. Again, a picture takes care of a lot of these note taking um, details as well, so I really encourage that. The toe arrangement and the degree of splay. So right now my toes are very splayed on my front foot, but now they're very unsplayed. So any given animal can control to a pretty significant degree how much splay it is expressing in any given foot, depending on how it was using that foot. There are a couple of differences, which we'll talk about in a minute. There are some animals that it's characteristic that they cannot splay. Stride length and trail width are factors you want to pay attention to. So it gives you oftentimes the size of the creature, which might take you down to a very short list of candidates, but it might also tell you how that animal is moving. There's a strong correlation between longer strides and faster movement. Similarly, trail width can be a very significant factor that will help narrow a list of possible candidates down. And then we get into this thing we call gaits, and that's the walking, trotting, galloping, and so on. That is a little bit more of an advanced skill, but pretty thrilling when you get there because that really does help you interpret an animal's movement. For me, it's like reading a story in a good substrate. Now I can, I love nothing better than being able to follow an animal along and know what was kind of it was taking an interest in, what it was doing, how what its mood it was in, all based on the way it was moving and what it took an interest in through its senses. And then habitat and context factors are also not to be ignored. So when I take pictures of tracks, I try to take a picture of a close-up like this, a picture backed out a little ways, and then maybe a picture of the trail itself in the context of where the animal was, because that could turn out to be important in ways that might not have been obvious to me in the field. And then, if you can get yourself to the point of wondering, why was this animal there, and bringing the whole landscape in for that reason, that's where the real stories start to unfold. Things to bring in the field. I do think a field guide is a great thing to have with you. But frankly, I don't use them all that much in the field. A lot of my field guide use takes place in the evenings after I come back from a field day, and that's when I will get my detail work done. But you should own a really good one. And I will mention Mark Elbrock's Mammal Tracks and Sign, a guide to North American species that will be shared with you by Leah later in a follow-up email. But that is the best, hands down, the best reference to North American tracks these days that you could have. So if you're going to have one book, that's the one I would suggest you get. A scale indicator, we've talked about that already. Measurement tools, which can be different because you can't measure things with a penny if they're not 3/4 of an inch, but having some other kind of measuring tool handy with you makes a big difference. And a camera to record your finds. And then the other things I have listed there without the highlighting are also kind of useful as well. Journal, again, I really like to plug that one. And a tracking stick, that is something you can take along to frame a track. Let's say you're with some other friends and they're new to tracking and they don't even see it at first. They might very well step on it. So you can frame it just to let everybody know where the area of interest is. Or you can use a straight tracking stick to help measure the stride lengths, even if you don't have a measuring tape. And I like to carry a stick just for the third point of balance sometimes. And plaster and accessories for making casts, I'll skip to that one. I usually have that in the car, and I have it carefully labeled because carrying around bags of white powder unlabeled is not a good idea should you be involved in a traffic stop or something like that. So I have plaster for wildlife tracking casts written carefully on each of my Ziplocs. Let's go through a quick review of the things that leave tracks commonly in our bioregion. So let's start with the deer. Everybody knows there's lots of deer around, but what most people don't know about deer is just how varied their tracks can look. So I have here an example of two deer tracks that were made by one of those crazy movements they make where they hop and land with all 4 feet after I've measured bounding motions of that type, rather hopping motions, because it's technically not a bound, it's a hop, um, up to 23 feet between groups of 4 tracks. So they can really launch themselves when they're moving fast. And when they land after a long hop like that, their dew claws often register cleanly as well. So you can see 4 toes in each of these tracks. You can also see a degree of splay in these deer tracks that most people don't usually think that animals can do, of deer as doing, because normally their 2 toes that register tend to make a heart shape pointing in the direction of their travel. But in a case like this, where it had reason to spread out its foot to land more stably, it actually pointed those 2 toes apart from one another a little bit, and that can be pretty pronounced. The other picture here is one of our smaller track makers. Gophers are, you don't think of them as getting up on the surface and leaving trails behind, but I have followed trails at Gazo's Beach in the spring of up to half a mile long. They tend to go to the surface, and I don't know if they're looking for mates or what it is that they're doing, but they cover a lot of ground, and their trails are really cute. But their short legs are so short, their strides are really small, and they tend to not be able to even do a full-on direct register with their hind feet landing on their front feet. They just barely begin to overlap them because they can't stretch those hind legs very far. But they do often drag their tails, which that might be what we're seeing here. In the mid-sized mammal group, we have some really familiar characters like the raccoons, shown here at the left, with their much bigger hind feet than front feet. Another fun fact about the raccoons is you've probably noticed that their front hands especially look like little human hands, almost like baby hands. And that's because their toes are actually directly connected to the heel pad with no interruption between, no negative space. That's really unusual. So it gives a look much like our own than most other mammals of the region. Skunks, on the other hand, are their big exception to the rule of toe splay because their toes are semi-fused so that their digging lifestyle is supported by a scoop. So their stubby little toes there at the upper right are all kind of jammed up together and they cannot splay out. And there's almost no negative space, just that one fine line between the heel pad and the toes. But there's claws way out there in front because they have long claws in their front that facilitate their digging lifestyle. And again, at the bottom, we have opossums where the hind foot and the front foot tend to land on top of each other to a significant degree. And I like to call them starfish tracks because they look like they've got way too many toes. Lots of times when you just see one that isn't very well defined, the one thing you can see is toes sticking out in all directions. And that alone is usually enough to tell that it's probably an opossum you're looking at. Now we're going to talk about some animals that move in a very specific style. Several of our local species, the lagomorphs like the rabbits and hares and the rodents, they typically move that, like a lot of animals have a comfort gait, a style of movement that they prefer above all others, and it can be a helpful identifier. These two groups have a style of moving called bounding, and in these groups, they actually swing their hind feet past their front feet while they're airborne and land in groups of 4 tracks with the hind feet out in front. Again, like if you look at those little itty bitty tracks to the right, you'll see that the tracks in the rear of each group of 4 have 4 toes, whereas the ones in the lead have 5 toes. That's a hallmark of a rodent, and it's the fronts that have the 4 toes and the backs that have the 5 toes. So they are landing in this classic bounding style. And my penny there indicates that you could fit probably all 4 of those tracks on a single penny. Those are tiny little tracks. You need some good substrate to catch that kind of thing. The other set here is from one of our local brush rabbits. And the brush rabbits have such furry feet that you might notice almost no toe detail there. However, their feet, especially their hind feet up here in the lead of the group, tend to be shaped like the prow of a boat and come to a bit of a point. And that's pretty unusual among our local track community. So between the vagueness of the foot details and that boat prow look and the set of 4 tracks with spaces in between, you can be pretty sure that you're looking at a rabbit. They're also known for leaving tracks in a Y pattern like this, where the hind feet are farther apart than the front feet. So the front feet kind of come in line with one another, and the hind feet are out on either side, creating a track group of 4 in the shape of a Y. Now we're looking at a couple of different kinds of reptile tracks. Reptiles leave really brilliant tracks sometimes, but they are subtler than most, so you really have to be looking for them. But dusty trails are great for that, especially in the summer. So on the left side, we have the trail rather, of a alligator lizard, and this alligator lizard was sliding very low along the ground, dragging its belly everywhere it went. So you see a broad, blank uh, trail there from its belly, but on either side where you see the footprints, you can see from the penny, this is not a huge trail, but I'm going to enlarge it further because I want you to see the detail that makes me love tracking in dust. So can you see the individual scales on the feet there? So this is one thing that I love to see and makes me want to go out to hot, dusty places just because the tracks tend to be exquisitely detailed. Exact kind of place I might not have liked to hike before I got into tracking. Amphibians, of course, leave trails as well, tend to be quite small and delicate. So up at the top left, we have a California newts trail in a drying puddle. You know, the footprints aren't especially clear there, but one prominent feature of a newts trail typically is that they tend to drag their tails everywhere they go, which is really not something you expect to see much in mammals at all. It's a very inefficient way for a mammal to move, but the salamanders do it habitually. And at the bottom, we have a crazy trail that a little chorus frog left behind. First, hopping. I'm going to enlarge this one too, so you can maybe see that there are toes pointing to the right. So this frog was hopping along, landing with its feet in the same configuration as it took off, but also its entire belly settling down and leaving a big divot in the middle. Long gaps in between the groups. And there's my penny again. So these are a little bit bigger than our mouse, but oh, skipping ahead here. Here we are. And then that frog got down to, you can see the change in sand pattern here. This where it went blank, that's because this bank suddenly became a steep drop off down to a stream at the left edge of the or right edge of the photo. And this frog, as it descended this steep slope off, slightly off balance, moved into a shuffling walk. So frogs can actually walk, and you learn these things by seeing their trails and how they move in real spaces. Invertebrates leave great tracks. I would never have thought I would be interested in the tracks left behind by bugs and such. But on the left here, that is the entire, probably 10 or 15-foot long imprint of a bull kelp. And if you've ever messed with a fresh bull kelp on the beach, you know they're really heavy and thick. But this one was feasted on by so many sand fleas overnight that they finished it off completely and left a perfect imprint of the bull kelp, with including its bulb at the top and all the fronds spreading out from it overnight. And that's what I found in the morning. And then on the right side, we have the track of a caterpillar in deep dust with some little mouse prints weathering on either side of it. So when we go out tracking with the tracking club, we never know what we're going to find, but sometimes. Oh, last weekend we had a tracking club outing, and one of the things that we found that was really fun was to find the trail of a slug's radula, its toothed tongue, where it had been scraping fungus off the underside of a log and left a very distinctive pattern from its side to side sweeping of its head. And even non-living things can leave tracks. So I like when I'm in the Sierra to notice glacier tracks in the granite. So it can be on that scale, or it can just be a piece of grass getting blown to and fro in the wind, which might tell you where the prevailing wind direction was overnight, which could be a very great interest in interpreting animal stories. But you could also be forgiven for thinking that was made by an animal unless you noticed the connection to the plant. And on the right side there, we have tracks left behind by ice crystals as they distributed themselves fractally as the frost grew in a drying puddle overnight. Let's give a moment's thought to how mammals move. So I mentioned before that that some animals hop and some animals bound, but most four-legged mammals are going to use the gaits at the top of this. So we know about walking, but our walking is not like a four-legged's walking. When a four-legged goes for a walk, it might be moving at speed. So if it's walking especially fast, its hind feet might actually swing forward of its front feet in each group of tracks, which would be kind of counterintuitive. We call that an overstep walk. Or it could be moving very slowly and its hind foot might be landing consistently behind its front feet, which would be an understep, which is actually kind of uncommon in four-legged mammals. Or it could be a direct registration where those feet are landing directly atop one another, which is surprisingly common. It's a very efficient way to move. Trotting is the next speed up, and that is often easily determined by measuring the stride length. So again, there's a strong correlation between speed and stride length. So when an animal's getting anxious, maybe it might break into a faster gait, or it could be deciding to head for a friend or some kind of food. There could be a lot of reasons why it's picking up the pace. And if it gets even faster, then it might be moving into what's called a lope, which is a rather bouncy gait where the animal goes airborne briefly between groups of tracks landing. And then if it really takes off and is going all out, that's what we call galloping. So you notice there's not a gait for the four-legged, it's called running. That's kind of a biped thing. So birds can do it, and we can do it, but the four-legged generally don't. They go galloping instead. And that usually results in groups of tracks, four tracks with relatively long breaks in between them and with the hind feet way out in front of the front feet. That's kind of the technical definition of a gallop, is when those hind feet land way out in front in each group of four tracks. And then we talked about bounding and hopping before, where either the hind feet lead in each track group or they don't, and that's what separates those two gaits. Could stay on that topic for quite some time, but time doesn't permit, but we'll look at that on the beach a lot. So I put this slide in because it's just one example of what you can learn from a gait. This was a trail from a coyote that made me laugh out loud. And I like to say when people burst into laughter looking at tracks at the tracking club that now you're tracking. Because when you're reading a story so clearly that it's just plain funny or gives you some other strong emotion, that's a very special moment. So what happened here was this coyote was moving away from the camera at a direct register trot. So see, those footprints are pretty far apart from one another, and they are landing singly, but each one is really a double. So each one is the hind foot landing on the front foot, and a detailed inspection reveals that clearly. But for now, we'll just say that the stride length is the main indicator of that. But then it got an urge, and without even really pausing, it managed to drop a scat. And then on the right side, we have a blow up of that. Oops, sorry. So you can see that here's its register footprints coming in, and then it just paused just long enough. And these feet weren't landing with power because it was just putting them down delicately as it kind of did a little dance as it squatted, dropped that scat there, and then just resumed its trot, as you can see in the longer trail on the left side, with virtually no hesitation whatsoever. The whole thing probably took about 15 seconds. Don't try that at home. So speaking of scat, scats probably cause more trouble for beginning trackers than just about anything else. In CyberTracker International's evaluator program, where they give certifications for different skill levels of tracking, they report that there are more errors on scats than just about anything else. So go slow, be cautious. There's a lot of ambiguous ones out there. But this one isn't particularly ambiguous. This is a bobcat scat. And just to give you an idea, this will represent all scats for the moment, but what sorts of things to look for when looking at a scat? Diameter, of course. Is it tubular? Yes. That's an important factor. They can take many different forms. As you know, deer scat tend to be in pellets. And these particular tubes are composed entirely of animal detritus. So this animal ate a meal of pure meat, which a coyote could do, but rarely would, and they would otherwise be of similar size and appearance in some respects. But you could rule it out if the all animal components, cats being obligate carnivores, tilt that way. Plus, this segmentation here, it tends to be perpendicular to the length of the scat and give it a sort of an old-fashioned Tootsie Roll look. That's an indicator. Plus, the cat family, when they make scats, those tend to be highly compacted. So if you were to poke it apart with a stick, it would resist. It would actually be pretty hard to push apart. Whereas a coyote scat will usually be loose and easy to pick apart. Raccoon even more so. And finally, the cats tend to put a mucus sheath around their scats as they come out, maybe because they're so compacted that might be painful otherwise. But in any case, those can actually be glistening when they are relatively fresh. And even now, they leave kind of a smooth patina on the outside. So those are some things to look for, and you can, in some cases, be pretty definitive. But in research studies, because of the number of ambiguous scats you'll find out there, they do typically go in for DNA analysis to have any level of certainty who they're dealing with. All right, we're getting close to the end of my presentation here. This is where we're going to go on March 1st. This is Gozo Creek State Beach. And one reason that beach stands out from most of the others in our region is because it does not have an abrupt headland with a cliff. Animals feel very anxious when they're trapped between surf and a cliff. Both their exposure to the potential wave action, but also predation would be more of a threat where they don't have somewhere easy to run off to and take cover. So at this beach, there's a very low gradient connection between the upland vegetated areas and this beach proper, and the ocean there too also provides its share of animal habitats that can interpenetrate those of the land a little bit. So we sometimes will see an elephant seal or other pinniped come up on the shore and leave interesting trails. So when we do go tracking there, you can see there's a reasonably sized parking lot there. There are porta potties, but it is a pretty isolated beach. So keep that in mind. There's not a lot of resources close by. There is, however, a brew pub right across the street, and that opens at noon. So just about the time we'd be finishing up. And there is a gas station with snacks and such there as well, right across the street. And there's some overflow parking on the other side of the highway there. You can see Highway 1 at the back right. Okay, so this is my last slide. We'll leave this up for a while as we take some Q&A. I wanted to just give you some pointers on how to carry things forward. Well, probably the most important thing is just to get a good field guide and learn how to use it. Read those first couple of chapters of introduction that put a frame around it and let you know how to use the field guide most effectively. It's time really well invested. And practice every chance you get. Learn the track of your own favorite shoes, those of your friends or family, or just choose a distinctive pattern when you're going hiking on somebody else's trail and try to follow it across multiple substrates. Just practice, practice, practice. It doesn't have to be something exotic to help you build your skills. Similarly, watch the tracks of pet animals and how they move and what their tracks look like in different circumstances. I think I saw earlier somebody actually picking up their pet in real time and looking at their feet. I was really pleased by that because that's a great thing to do, is to kind of register what details can be learned from looking at an actual animal's foot. And keep a dedicated journal of your observations and learnings so you don't lose your hard-won understandings. Sketching and measuring tracks not only records them for you, but it imprints them more deeply in your memory so that next time you're out tracking, it's much more easily recalled. And then, of course, join with others whenever you can. We have a saying at the tracking club that when you track alone, you're always right. And that's a problem because you can just make assumptions and get stuck on them for years if you don't test them against the perceptions of others. And that's one of the things I really value about the tracking club is we get many, many perspectives. And oftentimes it's a first-time tracker who will help experienced trackers see things in a way they've never seen it before because they're bringing fresh eyes and ask fresh questions. So we really love to see new people. So the Bay Area Tracking Club, our outings are always free. They're on the second Sunday of every month. And if you would like to get an invitation to the outing and a confirmation of its location, we do bounce around a little bit. There is the email, and we have two different lists for Facebook users and non-Facebook users. And there's a tracking school up in Marin called the Point Reyes Tracking School. If you have access to that one, love that one. And trackercertification.com, if you were actually ever getting to the point where you wanted to get an evaluation and find out how you're doing from a professional, that is possible. And you would go to that website to find out where the next one is being held. But I would recommend just going to it anyway, because not only do they have an online presentation series called Tracker Tuesdays that are donation based, but they also just have a whole lot of information on their site that can be of use to you. And then finally, I use iNaturalist.org all the time to put my own tracks up and get them tested by many other pairs of eyes and to study the ones that other people put up too. There are actual tracking projects on iNaturalist, such as a North American Animal Tracks database or Bird Tracks and Sign, where you can see literally thousands of pictures of other records of tracks and sign and people's analyses of them. So just a great opportunity to learn from the observations of others. All right, that is the presentation, and we'll move into some Q&A with our remaining few minutes.
Thank you so much for that, Garth. That was an awesome presentation. There's a lot of comments coming in the chat right now saying thank you so much, and people really expressing their appreciation for the talk. Yeah, let's head to some Q&A. And I think what we can do is just for time this time, I think I'm just going to read out the questions that we have, and then let's see, starting from the very top. Let's see. First question was from Margot, who was wondering, does the cougar's hind leg overreach the front as a rule?
So there's no easy rule on that, but they frequently do. And their comfort gait is what's called an overstep walk, in which the hind foot does typically swing forward to the front foot. So you tend to get two tracks on one side of the trail with the hind foot out in front of the pair. And then on the alternating side of the animal, that pattern repeats. And it goes back and forth from one side of the trail to the next.
Gotcha. Thank you. And thank you, Margot, for your question. And then Vicky was wondering, why do you think that the lion in the sand had its claws extended and visible in the print?
Oh, great. Thank you for reminding me. I didn't explain that. So reading up on that later, I was mystified by that too. So I did some research, and it turns out that when a lion has just made a kill, or this is also true of bobcats, uh, they tend to be overstimulated, and for a time they kind of lose their ability to retract their claws. So had I known that already, I would have known that looking at those tracks and seeing the claws register pretty consistently was actually a warning sign that this was an amped up animal that had just made a kill and might be in a really agitated state.
Cool. Great question, Vicky. We had a question from China asking, what is trail width? I think asking for definition there.
Right. Trail width is when you take a measurement from the outside of a left foot to the outside of a right foot in the trail. It's that distance there. So when an animal is moving really fast, and this is even true of us, its trails tend to converge towards the center and be narrower. And when they're moving in a relaxed pattern, and nice slow movements, then that trail tends to be wider. And there's a range for each animal of what's normal.
Cool. Thank you. And thank you, China, for your question. Margot was also wondering, can you differentiate buck from doe tracks?
So since you put that with asking me if I could, the answer is straightforward, no. Um, there are too many variables for me to feel expert. That's a kind of an edge for me is I would love to learn that. And there are people who claim to be able to do it really well. There are also some really expert trackers whom I respect who say that they don't really think that is a dependable skill. But hunters are who are restricted to hunting one sex or another frequently become pretty specialized in trying to do that. So I'm waiting for the chance to see somebody do it and prove that that's what they're able to do.
Mm. And Linda's question was about apps for tracking Facebook groups, and I'll send all of that out. All of Garth's resources, I'll be sending out an email with all that. So, and I think Garth covered that in the presentation. But then let's see. Jerry was wondering, can you talk about the difference between deer and pig tracks?
Yeah. So a lot of the Bay Area does have both. And first of all, I would say that pig tracks are going to usually, remember I said something about context earlier? It's rare to see pig tracks for very long without seeing a lot of uprooted soil, because they are pretty much wherever they're going, they tend to be snuffling around and digging stuff up. They make quite a mess as they move through a landscape. That said, their individual footprints, the dew claws, appear differently on the two. They tend to be larger and more prominent in the track for pigs, and pigs also tend to have, even though they have the cloven hoof like that, they tend to be more rounded at the front end, less pointed in the individual toes, and just a little bit broader as well.
Gotcha. Good to know. And then it is top of the hour, so but we can do a few more questions. But those of you that need to leave, please don't hesitate. But we'll just go through a couple more questions now, knowing that.
Yeah, and if anyone does need to leave, I just want to say big thanks for coming and look forward to meeting a lot of you out at the beach on March 1st.
We had a question about poop. I believe it was about cat versus canine poop. So is cat poop rounder, and how can you distinguish between the two?
I hinted before that's kind of a big question. So I did give some pointers when we looked at the bobcat poop. More compacted in the case of cats, and usually pure animal material. They can, of course, eat a little bit of grass from time to time. Uh, and coyote scats or canid scats in general, except for pet dogs, that's a different category altogether, tend to be wildly varied. So if you see like bug exoskeletons or a whole lot of berry seeds or something like that in it, it's not cat. Those are things that that a coyote might eat, but a cat would usually snug.
Awesome. Thank you for those pointers. And then question from Margot asking, is there a spot like Gazos Creek along the North Coast?
Oh, yes. Don't know how far up you're talking about, but the Point Reyes Tracking Club uses a lot of great spots up and down at the Point Reyes Peninsula, and a place called Abbott's Lagoon is relatively famous among trackers. If you go farther north, there are more opportunities that I don't know as well. I don't get that up there that far, but there are large herds of Roosevelt elk up around Redwood National Park, and I've had some really glorious beach tracking experiences up there.
Thanks for the recommendations and for your questions, Margot. We had a question from Cindy. Oh no, more of a comment. Love this. I docent at YOLO Basin Foundation. One of the stations is Animal Tracks, Signs, and Scat. This gave me some extra info to impart to the kids. Thanks so much, Garth. However, I will never eat a Tootsie Roll again. I have a question from Dana asking, I would love to have my students sketch animal tracks in the classroom. Do you know where I can find casts of tracks?
There's a business called Acorn Naturalists that I'm not sure that I know they're not plaster casts, but they do sell replica tracks that you can make impressions with if you're so inclined, or just study in and of themselves. And there are probably other companies too. I would think that Carolina Biological in their catalog might have something.
Awesome. Thanks for that, and hope that was helpful, Dana. And then we had a question from Sungji wondering about your slideshow. Is it possible to send a PDF of your slideshow to those who attended?
Um, I don't know. What's your thought on that, Leah?
It's totally up to you. I think if I'm happy to, if you want, I can send it out to people.
Yeah, I guess I'm gonna say I'm gonna say no to that, just because I would like to not see those pictures reappear in other contexts without the credit,
Mm,
without acknowledgement, and that I think that that becomes pretty possible once it gets out there into the internet world. So thanks for understanding. Some of these things are kind of treasured to me, like the big lion lie down.
yeah, that makes sense. And
We
thanks
will
for your
send some
question.
key points to you in a follow-up email from Leah.
Yes, and you will get the recording link as well.
Oh yeah,
So,
yeah.
and then let's see. Mm, let's see. We have a question about any pointers for finding tracks in woodland locations, and that's from Greg.
Yeah, it's not easy, be honest with that. So when the tracking club goes into areas like that, we tend to think of it as a track and sign type of outing, and we might do look for feeding sign, like wood that's been chewed on by wood rats or by a deer um, browsing or something like that, or scats, or dens, all kinds of things that are not footprints. But when you have, like right now, I was just telling Leah before the program, this is a great time to look because we've just had rain showers recently, but the puddles are now drying. No matter where you are, there were probably some mud puddles, and as they dry, they tend to leave some really fine silt or mud at the bottom edge of that. And for a brief golden moment there, um, delicate tracks can show up, tracks of tiny creatures like shrews and mice and salamanders. So it's a good time to check drying puddles because the fine material they leave behind is usually especially good at catching tracks, but only briefly, and not a lot of them because these tend to be small areas.
Gotcha. Thank you for that and for your question. And then Dan Steele had a recommendation too that there's a new tracking app called Wild Track available via the App Store with Apple. So thank you for that
Great.
recommendation, Dan.
Yeah, I haven't reviewed
Wild
that one.
Track
So
AI. Yeah. Um, and then yeah, I think those are all of the questions, but there are a lot of people saying thank you so much, Garth, and for um just sharing your expertise. Everyone is flooding the chat with big thank yous. So yeah, I think
my
we can wrap
pleasure.
it up.
Thanks for spending the hour with us.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you everyone for attending, and biggest thank you to Garth for making this presentation, for sharing it with us, for sharing your expertise, and those of you who signed up for the hike on March. Look forward to seeing you then. But I think we can wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Garth. Thank you so much for joining, everyone, and hope to see you at another event soon. Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.